You know what? I originally planned to make a complex version, but after I had some time to mull it over, I kind of realized I don't even need a complex version. It's just already too complex. This time we're going to be doing 3 different games instead of the old formula of doing Mario Brothers 3 times. Should be a grand old time. We're going to be talking about registers and addressing modes. First we got the old Standby. It's a game everybody knows and there's RAM maps all over the internet. Next we got a slightly more obscure game on here. It's common enough to have a couple RAM maps, but none of them are very extensive. And lastly, we got a game no one's even heard of. The only reason I'm actually choosing it is because I found it in the crypt in my basement. So now we got that out the way, let's go get some Tetris. Alright, for this brief period of time, we're going to be entering a no fun zone. So it's just going to be a bunch of refreshers and stuff I haven't went over in part 1 yet. What I have yet to go into detail about are the registers. We got 3 of them, X, Y, and the accumulator. These 3 are all you got if you want to store values for use. It's not like a modern day programming language where you could just get a variable, name it anything, and then bop, you're done. No, this is it. This is all you get. Most of the time though, you're going to be using the accumulator because that's the only one where you could do all the fancy math and the operations and such. Now, to prevent this video from being 2 hours long, I won't go into any more 6502 jank for now, but there will be some great examples later. Now, without further ado, let's get into some Game Genie codes for Tetris for the NES. Now, this ain't an easy task, so all I'm gonna have you do is get in your little gamer chair, get your Red Bull, get everything you need, get your fucking Tylenol, get your lotion. It is well known that the game of Tetris is not suitable for any human player, as it is much too complicated a task to perform. Yeah, like you told me you got 7 of these things and you have to keep track of where they all are in the same place. It's too hard. But don't fear, because I've created a Game Genie code to conquer this dilemma. It allows for only one type of tetromino, and I call it the J code. And here is the final product. Definitely my kind of Tetris. Now you might be surprised to know that I didn't actually use any RAM maps during the creation of this code. Tetris is one of the more common NES games with multiple different disassemblies all over the internet. Now we're not going to be looking at a traditional disassembly, rather we're going to be looking at a post from the Meat Fighter blog about applying artificial intelligence to Tetris. It's even got a link to the AI right here. This is also a great resource if you want to better understand the mechanics of the game. The part of the game's code we want to modify is the part that selects tetrominos. Here we can see that the game jumps to a linear feedback shift register in order to pick tetrominos. All you need to know is that this is what the game uses as a pseudo-random number generator. My first thought was to change a bit of code right here. This is the line of code that actually calls the random number generator subroutine. So then I thought, instead of jumping to that location, why don't I jump somewhere like right before the return statement? So that's what I did. I went to the jump subroutine, which is opcode 20 by the way, and I changed the 2 hex values for the hex value of the address right before the return statement. This leaves us with 2 separate Game Genie codes, one for each section of the address. Alright, so let's pop those suckers in, and it doesn't work. Which is to be expected. The process of making Game Genie codes is always a process of trial and error. And for the next couple hours, I was tweaking all these different sections of code, just trying to find a result. So then out of sheer frustration, I thought, what if I didn't tweak the random number generator, or circumvent it in any way? What if I instead avoided this entire subroutine being called entirely? In order to pull this off, I had to find exactly where in the ROM this subroutine was being called. So we'd have to find a section in the code that looks identical to this. Jump to subroutine, which is opcode 20, 0799. Because remember from part 1, the 2 hexes in the destination are switched. We gotta find where these string of hexes show up in the ROM. And keep in mind, they could show up in more places than one. Luckily for us, we use the old Control F and see that it only shows up once in the ROM. And it also happens to be right before address 9907. So then I changed the hex 20 to hex EA, which is a no operation opcode, which results in the Game Genie code XTAPUO. Now this Game Genie code technically works, but is not without consequence. And to find out why, let's look at the debugger. Here you can see that after we added our no operation opcode, a small chunk of the code has been corrupted. As we compare it to the image on the right, we can see that only addresses 9905 through 9907 have been corrupted, and the rest remain intact. What's causing these errors is the assembler reading regular hex values as opcodes when they're actually not. Since this section of code is not being run anyway, it doesn't matter, but it's just something to keep in mind when you go out and make your own Game Genie codes. Now before I move on from this Tetris segment, I will say that I didn't figure out how to make the Tetrominos anything but a J. I think this is because this is what the game defaults to if the random number generator isn't run, but if anybody knows how to change this with another Game Genie code, let me know in the comment section. Now we're going to be taking a break for a little bit and modifying existing Game Genie code rather than creating a new one from scratch. This one here takes you to Kirbys Adventure's debug room, which is completely inaccessible through normal gameplay. Alright, so let's slap this thing into the coder and see what we got. So it's modifying address 9215 and changing the value to A8, which happens to be the ID for the debug room. But what we got here? A compare variable? Why the hell do we need that? Well, with no compare, the value at the specified address will change no matter what. But if you include a compare, the value will only be modified if it matches the compare. But why even have a compare? Aren't the ROM values static? Well, yes they are for most NES games, but since Kirbys Adventure is such a beast of an NES game, it utilizes something called bank switching. For the NES, only 32 kilobytes of ROM is visible to the machine at one time. Kirbys Adventure size is around 471 kilobytes. So to get around this, the ROM will be split into different banks, and these banks will switch between each other really fast. This means one address can switch between a whole multitude of different variables, hence why you need that compare. Now just to prove my point, let's see what happens when we remove the compare from our code. So yeah, don't do that. Now we can just change this value and we can go to all the unused rooms we want. Want to go to room 14? Bam, you're in room 14. Want to go to room 17? Bam, you're in room 17. Want to go to room 145? Now how are we going to do that? As we can see from our favorite website, addresses 0562 and 0563 are responsible for holding the last two digits and the first two digits of the room respectively. Address 0563 is either going to be a 00 or 01 and will default to 00. So what we got to do is make it default to 01. Now you know the drill from part 1, add right breakpoint to find the code responsible, go up a couple lines and find where the value is loaded. Here we can see it's copying a value from memory that just so happens to be 00. So what I did was make it read a value in the ROM that just so happened to be 01. Now finally we got 3 goddamn Game Genie codes just to go to this stupid ass room. Needless to say, I am sick of Kirbys Adventure now. Now to wrap things up, we got a game called Yar Kung Fu, which is terrible opinion by the way. In this game you fight 5 opponents: Wang the Stick Man, Tao the Fire Breather, Chen the Chain Person, Lang the Shuriken Thrower, and Mu, who is Raiden apparently. This game was actually pretty revolutionary for its time. The original arcade version was the very first fighting game to utilize a health bar, and this port was Konami's first ever game on the Famicom. And I'm saying Famicom because this thing was only released in Japan. So this means you can't do Game Genie codes with it unless you have a 60 to 72 pin converter, or you are one of the lucky ducks like me who has a power pack. Y'all can suck it. Now for this one, we're not going to use RAM maps. In fact, we're not even going to use the internet. We're going to use nothing but our own 2 eyes. We're going to scan the hex editor to find a way to make it impossible to pause the game. Let me show you what my process was. First order of business was to pause the game a whole bunch of times to find an address that would toggle between 2 values exactly when I paused and unpaused the game. At first I thought over here was the culprit, but then I realized it would switch to another value while the game was still paused. But after a couple more pauses, the culprit jumped out at me clear as day. That's our RAM address, 0067. As we just saw, when this address is set to 97, all gameplay ceases. And when this value is set to 0, gameplay resumes as normal. Now you probably know what to do from here. Create a right breakpoint and find the code responsible for this change. We can see that 97 is stored in the accumulator and then loaded from the accumulator into our address right after. So this one's going to be a pretty simple fix. Just change that 97 to a 00. That will leave us with this Game Genie code, AEGGIA. And finally, with this code activated, we can bring up the pause screen but not actually pause the game. You're welcome. What up, thanks for watching the video. I apologize for it taking like 4 years for me to actually get a part 2 out. But hey, stay tuned for my next video though, because it's not even going to be remotely gaming related. And in the meantime, make sure to check out all my other stuff. And yeah, goodbye.